Uh, our next speaker is a passionate champion of individual freedom. His mission is to inspire, educate, and challenge his audience. He's the author of 3 books. We've Been Had. Let me grab the one here. 2084 American Apocalypse and Insurrection Resurrection. In addition to countless critically acclaimed articles and essays published in such publications as the American Thinker and the Washington Post, he is frequently a guest on podcasts and radio shows. Prior to his career as an author, James Keena was an executive in the automotive and computer industry. He graduated summa cum laude with a degree in economics from the University of Detroit, and he and his wife live in Michigan, where they have raised their 8 children and now have 20 grandchildren. I want to encourage you all to visit Jim's table, where he has books and literature in the back of the room before you leave. But for right now, I want you to please give Jim a very warm welcome.
And I really appreciate the Lakes Area Tea Party being this supportive of what's going on in the country right now. I made a couple of presentations to this group, and it was probably a different group at that time, but it was back in 2009, 2010, where I made some presentations. I was a part of the Rattle With Us Tea Party group, so I've been involved in this a long time, got some scars and battle wounds from it. And I also need to take just a small break here because I got to set up my computer. Okay, so today we're going to talk about what I believe is the most important issue in America for the next 2 decades. And this is going to be the battleground that decides the future of this country. So here's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to talk about the concept of states' rights. And I need to talk a little bit about the principle of federalism before I do that, because federalism is the basic architecture of our country, and that's where you start to see where the importance of states' rights. I'm going to talk about how federalism is under attack. We don't recognize the country now anymore because we're being assaulted by leftists and Marxists from every angle. What's happening as a result of this attack is that what you see in Washington now is there's an elitist cabal in Washington that is really nonpartisan at this point. And it's really become the elites versus everyone else. Everyone else in this country is being assaulted by our capital. So the antidote to that is states' rights, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to introduce a group that we started called Our State, Our Rights. And I've got a few closing comments and then some simple calls to action. Before I get into the actual slides, I want to do a slight preamble. I'd like you to picture yourself in America in the colonies in 1760. That was about 15 years before the Revolution, 16 years. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the colonists at that time actually loved Great Britain because they were British subjects. They admired the empire upon which the sun never set. They were British colonies. That was their country. That was what they believed in. Now there were some problems, and they were unhappy in the colonies with some of what was going on in London and in England. And so in the next few years, they started to address those with London, with King George and with Parliament. They sent letters, they sent delegations to London, and they did their best to try to say to King George and the British, hey, we love being British, but this isn't working for us. And as time went on, they were ignored. London ignored the colonists. And they imposed even more burdensome things like the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, the Declaratory Act. It just kept coming and coming, and the colonists were feeling greater and greater anger that they were not represented. London was not responsive to anything they wanted to do. And they actually warned London at one point, hey, this is going to lead to war if we don't fix this. And of course, London did not fix this. So that's the preamble. So what happened when London did not fix that was the American Revolution. And the important thing to understand about the American Revolution is it wasn't just a series of battles or wars, because it was the most uh, revolutionary thought in the history of politics. There had been thousands of revolutions around the world before. Kings were always deposed. There were always wars that one king beat another king. Revolutions have happened throughout history. This one was different, and it was completely different, because it was based on an idea. And it wasn't the idea of, hey, let's just get rid of King George and put a new king. It wasn't based on the idea of, hey, let's just vote some people out of parliament. What they said was, we're going to turn this whole thing upside down. This was the most revolutionary act in the history of the world. What they did was they said, we're not going to be subordinate to any leader. We are the sovereigns. That's where we the people, government by the people, of the people, and for the people came from. This was the first time in history that a people said, we're going to take control of our destiny. And then they ended up writing their own constitution. They ended up creating a system where they picked their own leaders. And that idea that they were sovereign to anybody else evaporated. This was the birth of individual sovereignty in the world. And at that point, it was hoped that it would be the death of centralized authority in the political world. Now, that was a very bold act by the colonists, and they fought a war, and there was lots of pain, suffering, and death. One thing they realized was, hey, it's one thing to be 13 colonies, and it's one thing to get rid of Britain, but it's a dangerous world out there. If you recall, at the time, the colonial empires were sailing their ships around the world trying to take over everything. So you had the French, the Spanish, the British, the Dutch, looking for colonies everywhere. And so the colonists realized that, hey, we need to form some sort of union or confederation between our states, or we're going to be picked off one by all these foreign powers. And so that's why they started to come up with the idea of a confederation or a federal government that would do a few things to protect the states. One would be mutual defense, so that if they're attacked by any of these powers, the states can work together to fend them off. International treaties and trade. If the states were trying to act by themselves in the international markets, they could be leveraged, abused, the countries could take advantage of them, play the states against each other, and they didn't want that to happen. But even more importantly, they wanted to protect the idea of free markets and interstate commerce. Because at the very same time that this revolution was happening, in 1776, coincidentally, Adam Smith published Wealth of Nations, which was sort of the intellectual birth of capitalism. And so what was going on is they wanted free trade between the states also. They didn't want tariffs and borders and tolls between the states. They wanted markets and goods to move freely between the states. So they came to this conclusion that, even though we've declared our independence, we need a federal structure to unite our activities. And so the United States was born. Now, in all of the debate leading up to that, there was a lot of fear about this, because you can imagine that these folks just fought a terrible war to get rid of a centralized authority. And now they were realizing, well, maybe we need a little bit of one. And part of controlling the little bit of one was they created a constitution. Oops, that's the wrong way. Okay.
Were we supposed to clap, Jim?
No, I would hold off just a little. So, what was this Constitution that created? And if you think about it, and maybe we've become so accustomed to it, we don't realize what this thing really was. But now that we declared that we were sovereign individuals and sovereign states, we needed to have some agreement with this federal government that we created that would protect our individual rights and our states' rights. So this Constitution is basically a set of checks and balances. That's what that thing is, designed to protect our individual sovereignty and our state sovereignty. So one of the checks was, hey, we're just going to give the government a few powers, and we're going to be very specific about what those are. And again, that was part of that revolutionary idea, is that it's not the government who's going to tell us what we can do. We're going to tell the government what it's allowed to do. Created 3 separate branches. Why is that important? Well, you gave a little bit of power to each branch, so they sort of had to play off against each other, and that helped prevent the federal government from getting too big. We had a bicameral legislature, 2 houses or 2 chambers of the legislature. Now that was an interesting concept because one chamber of the House was apportioned by population, the House of Representatives, such that it really was representing the interests of the people. The Senate was very different, and this is really important, not only back then, but for today's debates and dialogues. The Senate was meant to represent the interests of the states as states. And that's why it's not apportioned by population, it's apportioned as 2 senators per state. Each state is equal in that debate. So part of the check and balance here is if you could get something through the House, it meant it represented the will of the people. If you could get something through the Senate, it meant it represented the will of the states. So if you could do both, and you had to do both, the thought was, well, that means it represents the interests of the country. There was also the executive veto. If you got something through legislature, the executive could say, yeah, I still don't like it, I'm going to veto that. And if the legislature had enough votes, they could override the veto. So there's a lot of checks on the growth of power here. Lastly, was the concept of judicial review by the Supreme Court. So that even if the legislature said, I want to make a law, even if the president said, yeah, I signed it, it's a law, there's still the opportunity to challenge that law in the Supreme Court based on a constitutional basis. Underlying all of that, again, was echoing back to the concept that we the people are in charge of all of this. And we're just doing this to create some breaks and some obstacles so that the federal government doesn't get too big, just like the government we just got done revolting from in England. One of the ways I depict this is what I call the pyramid of power. And the whole basis of this principle of subsidiarity is that almost all the political power in our country should be at this level of the individual. And it's not just political power, but as I mentioned earlier, this whole notion of capitalism that was starting to blossom in America meant that there was a different kind of democracy coming. The democracy of you get to work where you want to work, you get to buy what you want to buy, you get to spend your paycheck where you want to spend it, you get to associate with whoever you want to associate with. That's where all of the real power in your life was supposed to be, is down here. People were free to make their own choices, make their own decisions, and be responsible for their own outcomes. And okay, maybe you need a little bit of local government because you might want a road, or you might want a school, or you might want a police department. State governments were important because they even existed before the federal government. Before the federal government was created, we had state governments. And the intent was, in the creation of the United States, was, from a state's perspective, it really didn't matter that there was this federal government. All the activity of individuals was supposed to be managed within a state. It was not supposed to be something directed by Washington or directed by the federal government. This little piece at the top was supposed to deal with those foreign issues, wars, treaties, things like that. So from the perspective of the states, the whole intent of the Constitution was to make our political life be from here on down at the state level. So, and interesting things happened in the last 250 years since then. That revolutionary idea where we told the elites of the world that we're in charge now didn't sit well with the elites of the world. It made them unhappy. And so what you've seen in the United States, even today, and we're wrestling with it a lot today, is there's people in the world who simply want to control things, run things, and tell you what to do. And so they've been hard at work over the last 250 years trying to find ways to destroy that concept of individual sovereignty and state sovereignty and tell us what to do. It started, believe it or not, with the Civil War, because wars, by definition, require a lot of government activity. They require drafts. They require, that was the first income tax to fund the war. They put people in jail, they censored stuff. I mean, they violated a lot of the Constitution in that war. Was that right or wrong? That's not my point. The point is, what you saw during the war was the birth of a powerful central government again. And what happened even more poignantly after that is when the South was brought back into the Union, the federal government basically took over the southern states. Was that good or bad? That's not my point. My point is, that's where this concept of state sovereignty really started to get eroded, and we started to see the beginning of a very powerful central government taking control of things again. Now, a little bit later on in World War I, we had two things that happened because wars, again, require money, and so the government went after it two different ways. That's when the Federal Reserve Act was ratified, and that's when the 16th Amendment was ratified. Now, the Federal Reserve Act created basically a national banking system, which enabled the printing of money and qualitative easing, basically creating money out of thin air. So when governments needed money, or our government needed money, they had a way to do it now. The 16th Amendment was the official federal income tax proposal. So the government now had a way to fund itself whether it was by printing money or taxing your income. The Great Depression was another major change in the relationship of people to their government, because it frightened everybody to death. The Great Depression was a terrible thing. And people were out of work, people were starving, businesses were going bankrupt. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his administration was actually looking to Europe for inspiration, which was a terrible idea, because what they were looking at was Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, and Stalin in Russia. And they started looking at what those countries were doing, because at the time it seemed like that was the solution of the mess. Just give the government more power, let's create these bureaucracies, let's start telling people what to do. Somehow we'll work our way out of the Great Depression. So that's where you start to see, again, another ratcheting of the federal government. In the 60s, we had LBJ's War on Poverty. And this was, as good intentioned as it may have been, it was another, took another leg out of the stool of the American philosophy of people are responsible for their own outcomes. If you want to be free, you have to be responsible for the results of your activities. And so we started to get this concept of entitlements, where people just get stuff for whatever reason, and a bigger bureaucracy to take care of everybody. So the government grew more and more. Of course, we had Obamacare. I mention that in particular because maybe you don't realize it, but the medical industry is almost 20% of our entire economy. So you had the government in one fell swoop in one program taking over 20% of the American economy. And then what we saw with COVID-19, I don't know how you all feel about it, but to me that was the most disastrous thing that ever happened to this country. Not the fact that it was a disease, that's bad, but what we lost was our entire Constitution at that point. The Bill of Rights was completely destroyed, and is never coming back, not through Washington. This was a monumental hit to the concept of federalism in America. And you saw that even where Fauci basically told everybody in the country, this is what you're going to do. Well, what happened to individual sovereignty? What happened to states' rights? I got this bureaucrat in Washington basically putting people out of work and forcing them to take vaccines. And at that point, it was very clear to me that we entered a post-constitutional country and the Bill of Rights was dead. It's going to get worse because climate change is going to be the same thing but on steroids. There will not be an element of your life that will not be associated somehow with climate change. And the government will force you to do something different, whether it's to put in a different light bulb, whether it's to drive a different car, whether it's to use an electric stove instead of a gas stove, whether it's to live within walking distance of every place that you shop or whatever, the new 15-minute city concept. What I was saying is climate change is going to be the reason why everything is going to change in America. If federalism isn't dead already, this will kill it completely. And what should be even more alarming to us is we're becoming beholden to foreign entities. That our Constitution was meant to protect us from an abusive central government. Now we're being subjected to an abusive world. There's all these alphabet agencies around the world, World Health Organization, whatever, that basically are starting to influence our policies and what we can do here in this country. So not to alarm you even more, but I have to pick at the scab a little bit. There's more federal overreach coming. They're not done. When I said that the elites were really unhappy that the Americans threw them out in 1776, they're coming back with a vengeance, and they're coming back for everything. And it's going to be even worse than London. So a lot of things that are on the table, replacing the Electoral College with national popular vote. There's countries or states that are doing that right now. They're basically saying, our vote's going to be whatever the national popular vote is. A lot of discussion about allocating senators by population rather than by state. So that would essentially mean we have two houses instead of a Senate and a House. This whole reliance on executive orders. You got Obama, who said he had his pen and a phone and he was going to do whatever he wanted to do, and now you got Biden, who's things like the student loan forgiveness thing, where he basically said, I'm going to forgive $400 billion of loans. Basically say, you people don't have to pay them, you people are screwed. He did that with a pen. So where is our Constitution when things like that happen? And like I mentioned earlier, you're going to see more and more of this extra national subservience, whether it's the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, the UN, the International Monetary Fund. All of these organizations are going to start to influence what happens inside America, inside your state, and inside your house. You're also seeing, beyond what happened in the 1960s, where there were some programs to help lift people a little bit, what you're seeing now is a more direct plea for just equity. Everybody should get the same thing. Whether it's free college, or everybody should have their own phone, everybody should have their own house, everybody should have this. You're seeing a lot of equity of outcome programs being proposed. The whole concept of a surveillance state, I don't know if this frightens you, but the idea that these tech companies are in some sort of unholy alliance with our federal government, the Homeland Security, the FBI, the National Security Administration, they are watching everything we're doing. And it's going to come back to haunt us, particularly when you talk about ESG, and when they start to take control over the banking process with a digital currency, and they've got all this data on everybody. As soon as they decide you're doing something they don't like, or they don't like you, imagine the power that that government's going to have. So this list is actually very long. I could spend a long time talking about what the federal government's about to do to you, but the point is a very simple one. Federalism is dead in America, and Washington is our enemy. I'm not offending anybody, am I?
No.
So this pyramid of power I showed you earlier, where us, we the people, we're supposed to be the foundation of everything, and most of the political power was supposed to be here, it's all now here. The federal government has taken everything. It's taking away your rights. It's imposing mandates that are unconstitutional. It's telling the states what they can and can't do. And it's going to make all of this here irrelevant. Our country is going to be the federal government, and that's it. So I'm going to make the premise here that the problem's in Washington. And what I mean by that is a few things. First, the federal government is now so big and powerful that it can do anything it wants. And I'll be glad to debate that point with you, if anybody wants to debate it. But if they want to do something, they just do it. Now, like I made that example of Biden with the student loan things. Right before the election, he said, well, I'll never get it through Congress, I'll never get it approved, it's unconstitutional, but I'll just sign it, I'll just do it. And that's the mentality in Washington right now. They believe they can get away with it. So we're on the verge of a post-constitutional America. The Constitution doesn't exist in Washington, D.C. right now. I think we think it exists in our hearts, and it exists in my hearts. I think it was the greatest political document ever created in the history of the world. But in Washington, D.C., that thing no longer exists. We're dreaming if we think they're following the Constitution. And I don't want to offend anybody here with this either, because I know this is a Republican group. But it doesn't matter what political party controls Washington now. The permanent state has taken over that city. I'm not saying it's taken over the country, it's taken over that city.
You're right.
And so what you have now are an alliance of these big banks, big tech, big media, big education, a lot of corrupt politicians. It doesn't matter who we send to Washington at this point. This show is over. Don't mean to alarm anybody, but Washington has become a permanent state that we're not going to change. So the premise is Washington can no longer be reformed through Washington by Washington politicians. And we've basically come full circle. The states formed the federal government in 1776. And I think we have to remember that. The federal government didn't create the states created the federal government. And now we're at the point where if you read the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson's words very carefully, he says, whenever a government becomes abusive or dangerous to you, it is your moral obligation to fix it. And that doesn't mean we have to tolerate anything that comes out of Washington. So we've come full circle. We're back to where we were in 1776. When you look at Washington in 2023, I don't think it looks any different to us than London looked in 1776 to the colonists. I think we're in exactly the same spot.
You're right on.
So again, I don't want to offend anybody here, but merely sending some more Republicans to Washington is not going to fix this. I'm not telling you not to vote. If you like DeSantis, if you like Trump, vote for him. I'm just telling you, in all honesty, it's not going to fix anything. The government's going to get bigger, it's going to get more powerful, the surveillance state's going to dig deeper and deeper, and these extranational organizations are going to influence our lives more and more, no matter who we send to Washington. You know, there's an argument, and it's not a bad argument, that, hey, if we at least elect some Republicans, they slow this process down, that we slow the march of Marxism in America. Yeah, I think that's true. I think the Republicans slow it down. But there's something called the ratchet effect, where when the Democrats get power, they just go all out. I mean, you can see it even right now with the Biden administration. Whatever they can throw against the wall, they're going to throw it against the wall, and most of it sticks. And then when the Republicans take over the next administration, they don't do anything bad, but they don't fix any of that. They don't remove any of that. I was a part of the Tea Party group back in 08 and 09 when Obamacare came on and the Republicans were going to repeal and replace. Well, I'm still waiting for that. It hasn't come. So this idea of the ratchet effect, where the left just throws everything against the wall when they're in power, and the Republicans go in there and say, yeah, we'll hold the fort for a little while until the left's back in there. We got to do something different. So if I haven't alarmed you enough yet, this ought to alarm. This chart, when I first saw it, scared the crap out of me. Because when you start to think about, we're losing the whole concept of states' rights. We're losing, the Electoral College, for instance, to this concept of national popular vote. Senators are going to be elected by popular vote, or apportioned by population rather than by state. When you start to lose that concept of the state and the power that a state has, something terrible happens. This map is very detailed, but all you need to know is there's two colors on it. There's gray counties and there's blue counties. Now, interestingly, half of the United States lives in the gray counties, and the other half lives in the blue counties. So stare at that map a moment and figure out who's going to rule your life with an all-powerful federal government. It's those people in those blue cities. That's where we're headed, folks. So this is where I make the argument that the only remaining hope is states' rights. I said a moment ago that we're not going to fix Washington through Washington with Washington politicians. So what do we have left? And I'm not looking to create some sort of revolution. I'm looking for some constitutional means. We actually have one. We have the 9th and 10th Amendments to the Constitution. And I think we're at the point where this is the line in the sand we have to draw, or else this show is completely over. And why do I say that? If you look at, I talked earlier about all those checks and balances that are in the Constitution. The ones that pertain to Washington are gone. There are no checks and balances in Washington. It's a uniparty. They're all in it together. It's the elites versus everyone else. Any check and balance you think in Washington does not really exist. You're under a false illusion if you think that. Now, this is an interesting thing to me because I've been pretty active in the Tea Party movement and politics, and I get a little bit frustrated because you march and you raise your fist and you carry signs and whatever. The truth of the matter is, no matter how passionate we are, we don't have the power of a state behind us. That we can yell and scream all we want, but we're just random individuals. We don't have territory that we control. We don't have police forces. We don't have armies. We don't have anything. We're just random people. Now, states, however, are very different. If you take the state of Florida, for instance, they have their own geographic area, their own economic system, their own government, their own operational resources. Florida can do something, and Florida is doing something. And so I'm going to suggest that if we really want to make a move to stop the encroachment of the federal government, it has to be through this thing called the state, because they have the gravity and the power to actually do something. The other thing that's interesting about states' rights is I'm very frightened about, as I mentioned earlier, all these alphabet soup of organizations around the world that have basically taken control of Washington. And so it's through Washington that they're influencing us. Now, if there wasn't such a thing as Washington, and be careful, that probably sounds worse than I meant it to be, but it's harder to corrupt 50 states. If you had to go to 50 state governments, and all these worldwide organizations had to go to all 50 state governments and corrupt them, that's a hard thing to do, as opposed to just going to Washington, where we have no control as people. None. We have zero. and there's all kinds of money, all kinds of lobbying, bribery, whatever. They can control Washington. I'm doubtful that they could control 50 separate states. Another interesting thing is having an alliance of independent-minded states who are willing to confront the government can be very powerful. And we're starting to see that. I mentioned Florida earlier, but there was a recent lawsuit that was joined by 18 states, 18 Republican states, against the federal government. And so when you start to get that kind of an alliance going, you actually have some power. You have the power of 18 attorneys general in the states, you have the power of 18 governors, you have the power of the states to simply say no. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. So the bottom line of this, if you think about what the words of the Declaration of Independence say and the situation we're at as compared to where the colonists were in 1776 compared to London, we don't have to submit to Washington. We're not required to do that. Just because they've gone off the deep end and taken control of that city does not mean we have to submit to them. So I'm sure all of you know this, but just a quick tutorial on states' rights. The 10th Amendment is actually pretty clear, and it was put in the Bill of Rights for this very reason, because the founders had long debates about how much power do we give the federal government, how do we protect the state's powers. And so this amendment is very, very clear. It says if the Constitution does not literally give the federal government a specific power, all other powers belong to the states. That's why that amendment was inserted in the Constitution. In my opinion right now, it's the only amendment that means anything in that Constitution. The 9th Amendment, I lump in with it because the whole premise of the United States was individual sovereignty and state sovereignty. So the 10th Amendment talks about state sovereignty. The 9th Amendment is interesting too, because it talks about individual sovereignty. And another thing the founders were frightened of when they created this Constitution was, well, hey, if we do something like the Bill of Rights and we say they got the right to assemble and the right to speak and these other things, people are going to think at some point in the future that that's the only rights that they have, because those are the ones listed in the Constitution. And the 9th Amendment said, no, just because we listed those, the people keep all their other rights too. So if the states have all the power and the people have all the rights, why are we letting Washington, D.C. run away with our lives? So that's basically what all of this means. The 9th and 10th Amendment means is that going back to the concept of we the people. It's a government by the people, for the people, and of the people. And that's what those two amendments guarantee us. And those are the only two things we have left to rally around. So why is it so important to have power at the state level? One of the things about our country, and it's a wonderful country, and it's an interesting country, is the states are all very different. If you look at Alaska, you look at Hawaii, you look at Florida, you look at Montana, those states have nothing in common. Nothing in common in terms of culture, values, resources, challenges. So each state should have the right and the authority to create a government for themselves that can deal with their unique situation. If you have Washington controlling everything, you've got one solution for 50 different problems, and it makes no sense at all. The other thing that's important about having 50 strong states is the concept of a laboratory. And if you think about the COVID situation, again, we have one federal government that was telling us what to do. In fact, it was one guy, it was Anthony Fauci, saying, everybody in the country is going to do this. Was he right? Was he wrong? Well, I don't know, but it would have been really interesting if we'd have let each state say, here's what we're going to do. And to some extent, states like Florida did that. And their experiments were interesting. And I'd like to see 50 states experiment, not only with just COVID, but with everything. I think that's one of the beauties of this opportunity is that we could learn from each other. But if the only thing that's done in America is what's dictated by a bureaucrat in Washington, you lose this completely. I talked about each state having greater political sensitivity to local issues. I also, when I showed you that chart of the map by, or the country by county, again, if all power is nationalized at the federal level, it's going to be the small but densely populated areas that will control everything. So, you know, in your little Republican county, it's going to mean nothing because it will be run by LA County, it'll be run by New York, it'll be run by Chicago. And if things get really bad, when you have one federal government running everything, there's no escape from it. I mean, if things start to come off the rails and you think, wow, I really don't like what's going on, where do you go if the federal government controls everything? Whereas if you have very strong and robust states, you've got 49 other options, like if you're unhappy in Michigan, for instance. I'm not saying you have to move, but there's actually 49 other places to go if you want to think differently about how to live your life. I mentioned earlier that the founders were actually very frightened of this thing called the federal government, and even of the Constitution. There was a lot of interesting debate, if you read the Federalist Papers and some of the other writings at the time, about this Constitution is going to run away. That no matter what you do, no matter how many checks and balances you put into it, it's human nature, and it's the nature of the elites who want to take control of everything. They're going to find a way to use that Constitution against we the people, and they're going to take power in this country again. And Patrick Henry called it the infinitude of the Constitution. He said there's enough loopholes in this thing that someday, like now, this Constitution is going to mean nothing. And so, in his view, and he was arguing this at the time, he said state sovereignty is the only thing that could ever protect us from that. And we're at that moment right now. One more point about states. I think some people are fearful that, geez, if we didn't have this strong central government, how would we live? How would we get along? What would we do? How would we possibly survive without this great big Wizard of Oz federal government? Well, the interesting thing is those states existed before the federal government and managed to get along just fine. And as I mentioned earlier, every state's a viable political, geographic, and operational entity. It's just like a country. Our states have everything that a country has elsewhere in the world. We don't need this other layer of government telling us all what to do. Just to put it in perspective, if you think about the economic power of some of our states, if California was a country, it would have the 5th highest GDP in the world. There would only be 4 countries in the world that would have a higher GDP than just the state of California. Texas's GDP is bigger than Canada's. That great big blotch on the map north of the United States. Texas, one state's GDP is bigger than all of Canada's. New York is bigger than Russia. That great big boogeyman that we're all afraid of is going to take over the world and run everything? New York's GDP is bigger than all of Russia's. Florida's is bigger than all of Mexico's. Even Michigan's not that great of a state anymore in terms of economic output, but it is bigger than Austria's and Norway's, and they're all countries. My point is that these states have whatever means they need to lead their lives and structure the way they want to live. They don't need this magical, mystical thing called the federal government to tell us all what to do. So this is where we get to the organization that a number of us have formed here. It's called Our State, Our Rights. And it's really based on that whole concept of the 9th and 10th Amendment. Our state, the 10th Amendment, our rights, the 9th Amendment. We're a volunteer organization. We're just a bunch of citizens passionate about individual and state sovereignty. Our vision's pretty simple. Less control by Washington, more control by individuals over their own lives, and more control by states over their own destinies. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm not some flaming radical who wants to burn it all down. I still think the Declaration of American Independence and the U.S. Constitution are the 2 greatest political documents ever written. But they point to a couple of things here. As I mentioned earlier, the Declaration of Independence literally tells us that when the government becomes abusive, it's up to you to do something about it. And the 9th and 10th Amendments say, you got all the power, my friends, the citizens. Washington doesn't. So even within our own founding documents, the path should be fairly clear to us. And our organization believes that resisting tyranny is our right and our moral duty. And we're going to do it without violence. That there's nothing in our philosophy that says we got to march on Washington. I want to do exactly the opposite. I want to turn our backs on Washington. I don't want to march on anybody. I just want to live my life the way I want to live my life, and I want my state to be able to do that too. So we do have a website. This is just a picture of it. You'll see a lot of interesting articles about the concept of states' rights, about the concept of federalism, and about how the issues that are currently going on in America are framed in that lens. We're putting together a pretty good resource depository of what does the Ninth and 10th Amendment mean? What does federalism mean? What are some of the current lawsuits going on in the states that are going to affect this concept of federalism? What are some of the landmark Supreme Court decisions? So we're trying to build a repository of information that people can use to start to build their knowledge of what this means. But what we're going to do in 2024 is start to hold state leaders accountable. And by that I mean we're going to start to pester them to get them to talk about, well, what is your vision of states' rights? You're the executives of the state. It's your function, and perhaps, I'm going to argue, their most important function right now is to resist the tyranny of the federal government. So what is your perspective on that? And I want to get them on record with that, and I want to monitor their performance over time to see how they actually step up to that. We also have a Facebook page called Our State, Our Rights. Just a minor note, there's another Our State, Our Rights Facebook page that's not ours. Ours has the 2 periods, and it looks like this. So don't be misled by that. But you'll see a lot of the stuff on the Facebook page that's on our website. So some of the early steps for Our State, Our Rights. And I say this in the framework of, I mentioned at the beginning that I see this battle going on for the next 2 decades. I think there's going to be a lot of turmoil in America. I think the battleground will end up being the states and everyone else versus the federal government. But right now, the first step is to educate, because I don't think that's a top of mind thing for people right now. And part of what I really want to accomplish is to reframe the discussion. I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't, support your candidate in Washington or you shouldn't support your candidate in Michigan. But particularly in the states, I think we need to think differently about why we're nominating people for office and why we're voting for them. Because my opinion is that we're getting close to the point where it doesn't matter who we elect at the state level. Because if Washington has so much power that your state politician can run on this platform plank or that platform plank, and he's going to do this or she's going to do that. But if Washington controls everything, what does it matter? So the most important thing we can do with our state leaders now is to get them to realize that if you're going to have any authority at all in this state, you better resist that 800-pound gorilla in Washington. And the positions that have a lot of influence on that, I've listed there: the governor, the attorney general, the secretary of state, the legislators, and the Supreme Court justices. So what we want to do with our organization is screen those candidates for those offices with regards to their states' rights commitment, publicize their positions as we learn them, and then once they're in office, hold them accountable to those promises. Now, interestingly, you're starting to see some of the states actually exercise the powers they really have, and the states have a lot more power than they realize. I think they're just afraid to do it, with a few exceptions, like DeSantis in Florida, for instance. But governor, this whole concept of nullification is a really interesting one, and it's something that Thomas Jefferson had pushed way back at the founding of the country, that if a state sees a federal law or a mandate that is unconstitutional, the state has a moral obligation to resist it. And he described it as nullification, meaning refusing to allow state officials, personnel, facilities, or resources to execute whatever that unconstitutional federal mandate is. Just nullify it. We're not going to do it. A powerful thing the legislators should do is every time the federal government issues a mandate or creates a law that violates the concept of states' rights, the legislation should create the opposite law. And the purpose of doing that is at some point we're going to push this all to the Supreme Court. And you have to have a basis upon which to do that. So if the federal government says we're going to forgive all student loans, the state should say we're not going to forgive all student loans. At some point that's going to get pushed to the Supreme Court. Who's going to win? I don't know. But unless you start to, at the state level, legislate anti-federal legislation, you don't really have a basis to challenge it. The attorneys general have a lot of power. They actually have the ability to sue the federal government. And like I said earlier, when you get 18 attorneys general together on one issue and sue the federal government, you're starting to have some real power, more power than we've got as random individuals in this room here. They can also refuse to prosecute state citizens who maybe follow the direction of their governor and say, we're just not going to execute that federal law. and our attorneys general can say, well, we're not going to prosecute anybody who does that. And the secretaries of state have a really important obligation, which is to maintain a fair election process in the country. So I said this is like a 2-decade effort, so I'm not expecting anything to get fixed today or tomorrow. But just like when I started this preamble in 1760, talking about 1760, they didn't fix everything right away either. It took them 16 years to get to the point where they said, something's really wrong here, to the point where they said, we're going to separate from London. And I think we're kind of in that same spot. But the first step is this education thing. We need to start to think about this. Just like the colonists in 1760 were thinking about this, it started to dawn on them that, this is not good, and we need to do something different. We're in the same spot. We need to start to think about what we're going to do differently. Like I said, sending more politicians to Washington is not the answer, so we need a different one. So we need to focus on getting 10th Amendment leaders people are passionate about that at the state level. We need to hold them accountable. And we need to encourage more and more of what we're starting to see between the Republican states of just aligning their activities, challenge the federal government as a group of states rather than one state at a time. If you get frustrated with your own state, just as a personal decision to make, and you're seeing this sorting hat going on in America already, because California lost 400,000 people in 1 year. They lost a representative or two in the House. And Florida picked up 400,000 people net. So they didn't all come from California, but that's just the net of it all. But it's an important thing that's going on in this country now, is people are starting to move to places where they think, this more closely aligns with my values, and if push comes to shove someday, this might be where I want to be as opposed to some other place. And another interesting data point, there's a hypothetical center of America, a population center of America. It used to be around Peoria, but it moves every census. For the entire history of the United States, that population center, after every census, has moved westward. The net movement of the country has been towards the west. This last census was the first time it moved southward. That there's a very powerful migration from the northern states to the southern states. Another interesting thing to be done as we get frustrated about Washington and even our own state is there's a number of states where there's a movement within those states to split the state. Like California has a fairly robust movement where there's a lot of conservative sections of Florida that are just completely unrepresented by the leaders there. And they're looking to split California into two pieces. You're seeing the same thing in Washington, the state of Washington, the state of Oregon. There's counties there that want to break off and join Idaho or something next to them. But even in Michigan, this thought occurs to me too, because Michigan's become a purple state, and some even say it's a blue state now. But when you look at the map, county by county, it's a red state. Michigan is a red state. And there's just a couple of pockets, like I showed in that map of the country, where there's some blue pockets. The Metro Detroit's a blue pocket, the city of Grand Rapids is, Flint is. The whole rest of the state is red. So at one point, do we start to think, hey, maybe there should be two states? Those kinds of thoughts need to start percolating in our heads. And I hesitate to say this because this is last on the list, and it's a long ways down the list. But this is actually where the founders ended up. They seceded from London. After they did all these kinds of things, they said, you know what, this ain't working, we're out of here. But that should be on our list. Not because we're going to do it tomorrow, but if you don't start to think about, well, if that day comes, maybe we should have done all these other things first. And it's probably time to start that. Oh, looks like my signal. All right, let me go really fast. I've said most of this already. The 800-pound gorilla is Washington. So as you're electing your state leaders, think about how you're going to fight that 800-pound gorilla. And we'll skip the rest of that just for the sake of brevity. A couple of calls to action. If you would, I'd be interested if you signed up for our mailing list. We've got some index cards that have gone around the tables. If you just put your name and your email address on those, we can get you onto our website. You can get all of our interesting stuff. Share this presentation with your friends. There's a QR code at the table back there with some books. that if you just click on that QR code, it'll bring up the presentation, this presentation you look at here. So you can email that or forward it through social media if you want to do that. If you wanted to donate $1 or $2, that would come in handy because we do have some expenses trying to get this show on the road. And as I mentioned, we have a website and a Facebook page where you can learn lots of other interesting things. And lastly, since I'm an author, just one quick blurb about my book, and I'm almost done. My latest is called 2084 American Apocalypse. It's a mystery novel, but it's an idea, a novel of ideas, sort of like 1984 and Atlas Shrugged. Those were really powerful novels, but they also had a very powerful theme and some very deep ideas in them. So you'll see the same thing in this book. It's a very thought-provoking book, and it takes a look at where, if the current trends in America continue, what's the world going to look like in 2084? And it's more than just, hey, this is bad. There's also a vision in that book. That after 2084 happens, what's the real vision for prosperity in America? And that's it.